Last night, something happened in my own kitchen that I never expected, and it left me questioning everything I thought I knew about myself, my marriage, and the quiet connections that form between people when no one else is watching. What began as a simple moment of help turned into something far more profound. Before I dive in, let me know in the comments which city you're watching us from. I always love seeing how these stories travel across the country. Now let me take you into my world and tell you what really happened. It was a Saturday evening, and my husband had invited a few colleagues over for dinner. I've always enjoyed hosting, though at my age, I sometimes find myself more exhausted than excited about entertaining. Still, I set the table with care, polished the wine glasses until they shined, and made sure the roast was cooking slowly in the oven. The house smelled of garlic, rosemary, and the faint sweetness of caramelizing onions. When the doorbell rang, my husband greeted his guests with his usual charm. Among them was Daniel, a colleague of his I had only met once before in passing. Daniel was younger than my husband, mid-40s perhaps, with kind eyes and a warmth in his voice that immediately set him apart. He carried himself with ease, but there was also something grounded about him, as though he listened more than he spoke, noticing details others missed. The evening flowed easily. Laughter floated across the living room as stories and jokes passed around. But in the kitchen, things were different. Hosting meant slipping away to check on the food, refill dishes, or tidy up quietly in the background. Usually it was just me in there, moving around unseen. But this time, when I walked in to check the roast, I noticed Daniel had followed me. "Need a hand?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves slightly. I laughed softly, almost out of habit. "Oh, you don't need to bother yourself. Guests are supposed to relax." He smiled. Sometimes helping feels better than sitting still. And just like that, he began passing me plates, holding the cutting board steady as I sliced vegetables, even wiping down a splash of wine I had accidentally spilled. His movements were quiet, respectful, but there was something else, a subtle awareness of me, as if he was paying attention not just to the task, but to the way I breathed, the way my hands moved. At first, it felt strange. I wasn't used to anyone stepping into that private space with me, especially not one of my husband's colleagues. But as the minutes passed, I realized how natural it felt to have someone share the rhythm of the kitchen with me. The small space filled with warmth, not from the oven this time, but from an unspoken connection that seemed to grow between us. We didn't talk much at first, just the occasional exchange. "Pass me that knife," or "Careful, that pan's hot." But beneath those simple words was a current I couldn't ignore. His voice had a softness that lingered, and his presence made the air feel charged in a way I hadn't experienced in years. When I reached for a bowl on the top shelf, he instinctively stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine as he steadied the dish. It was nothing, just a touch, accidental even, but it sent a quiet shiver through me. I pulled back quickly, hoping he hadn't noticed the flush rising in my cheeks. But he did notice. His eyes met mine, and in that brief moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavier than words, filled with an understanding that something unspoken was happening between us. Not inappropriate, not rushed, but deeply human. I busied myself with the food, trying to shake off the feeling. Yet every time he moved beside me, every time his hand brushed close to mine, I felt that same quiet spark. The kitchen, which usually felt like just another room in the house, became something else entirely, a place where time slowed down, where two people could share a moment without anyone else realizing. Finally, as we carried the food out to the dining table, he leaned in slightly, his voice low so only I could hear. "You do all this so beautifully. Your husband is lucky." The words caught me off guard. I managed a polite smile, but inside, my heart was racing. It wasn't just the compliment, it was the sincerity in his tone, the way he said it like he truly meant it. No one had spoken to me like that in a long time. The rest of the evening went on as usual, laughter, wine, and conversation filling the house. But for me, everything felt different. I carried the weight of that moment with me, wondering what it meant, why it lingered so strongly, and what it might awaken inside me that I thought had been long forgotten. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I replayed it over and over in my mind. The brush of his hand, the look in his eyes, the quiet intensity of a compliment spoken in the smallest of moments. I knew then that something had shifted inside me, though I couldn't yet name it. And that was only the beginning. The morning after the dinner felt like the quiet after a summer storm, clear, almost too bright, everything a little more defined. I woke before my husband, the soft tick of the hallway clock pacing the house like a patient dog. The kitchen still carried the scent of last night, rosemary clinging to the cutting boards, the faint sweetness of the caramelized onions, a ghost of red wine in the air that made me think of the laughter that had once filled this room. I stood at the sink with a mug of coffee, watching a bead of water crawl down the window pane, and thinking about Daniel's voice, the way it settled into the spaces of my mind as easily as it had settled into my kitchen. I wasn't used to the feeling. It wasn't a crush, and it wasn't longing either, at least not the kind anyone would scandalize. It was something subtler and in a way far more dangerous, the sensation of being seen. I kept replaying that quiet moment when he steadied the bowl and his eyes met mine. The way he said your husband is lucky. It had landed in me like a note held just a beat longer than expected, not loud, not showy, but impossible to ignore. Around 9, I started clearing the last of the dishes, half hoping that motion might break the spell. I stacked plates, ran hot water, and tried to focus on practical things. I was drying a glass when a rumble of tires pulled into the drive, and before I could wipe my hands, there was a soft knock at the back door. "Hey," Daniel said when I opened it, holding up a folded dish towel as if it were a peace offering. "I took this by mistake last night. I'm sorry." He smiled, the small, apologetic kind, and added, "And I realized we left before you got a chance to actually sit down." "You came all the way back for a dish towel?" I asked, surprised at how easily the warmth rose in my voice. "I came back because leaving felt unfinished." He stepped just inside, careful the way people are when they respect a space. "Do you need help with anything?" I almost said no, reflex more than intention. But the sink was full, and also, if I'm honest, so was my heart. "There's always something," I said, gesturing toward the counter. He rolled up his sleeves again, the same gentle ritual as the night before, and slipped into the rhythm beside me. There wasn't much to do, really. Still, the work made a kind of music. A plate set down softly, the whisper of a towel, the sigh of water settling. It's funny how quickly an ordinary task can become a ceremony when someone is fully present for it. We talked. Not in the light, floating way of a party, but in the grounded way of two people who have decided to trust the morning with their words. He asked me about the roast. I told him it was my late mother's recipe, and before I knew it, I was talking about my mother's patience in the kitchen, her elbows dusted with flour, the way she corrected the heat of a simmer by ear. I said I used to paint years ago. Portraits, mostly in oils. Then life happened, and the canvases were replaced by calendars. I said it without bitterness, surprising myself. I learned to cook because my mother couldn't, he said. She was a nurse. She used up all her tenderness at work and kept her practicality for home. But now, he paused, the dish towel stilled. Now she mixes up names sometimes. The meals she taught herself revolt against her. so I visit on Sundays and make what she thinks she remembers." There was no self-pity in his voice. It was plain-spoken, like listing ingredients. It was also more intimate than any flirtation could have been. It made me feel tender and sturdy at once. A streak of rosemary was clinging to my forearm, a thin green thread against my skin. He noticed before I did and reached for it. The movement was careful, slow enough that I could step away if I wanted to. I didn't. His fingers brushed my arm lightly, lifting the herb free. He held it up, the tiniest trophy, and we laughed, quietly, because the house seemed to be listening. The moment lasted just a breath longer than it needed to. Not a trespass, not a promise. Just a small recognition that something delicate and unamiable had entered the room with us. When the dishes were done, the kitchen looked as if the night had never happened. I wanted to keep him a few minutes longer. What a surprising thing to admit. I poured a little more coffee into my mug and offered him tea. He chose tea. We sat at the end of the table where the morning light came in at an angle, turning the wood into honey. I could hear my husband moving upstairs, the heavy tread of someone still half dreaming. The sound grounded me. It did not make me ashamed. It made me honest. Whatever was happening here wasn't a betrayal. It was a remembering. "I brought something else," Daniel said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He unfolded a small card that looked like it had lived there a while. "My grandmother's lemon custard pie. I was thinking about your roast, and, well, this wants to be eaten after a meal like that." The card was soft at the edges, the letters slanted. Someone's patient hand copied one line at a time. In the corner, a faded water ring pressed into the word zest. I ran my finger along the ingredient list. The recipe was simple but precise. The kind of simple that grows out of years, not shortcuts. "You're trusting me with a family secret," I said. "I'm trusting you to do it justice," he said, and there it was again, that quiet note striking something inside me. We talked about food and art the way people talk when they really mean to talk about themselves. He asked what I used to paint, and I told him I loved capturing the moments in faces that come just before a smile or just after. Those transitions you can miss if you blink. I told him I didn't know how to start again. He told me about a community kitchen near his apartment that hosted classes for veterans and young people aging out of foster care, teaching them how to cook 3 good meals and talk to one another at the same time. He said they needed volunteers. People who understood flavors and patience. People who knew how to make a space feel like home. "I'm not sure I'm the right person," I said, though my voice lifted in that way voices do when the heart knows it's lying. "You feel like the right person," he said. He didn't push. He let the suggestion sit between us, the way a coat waits by the door for someone to decide the weather. Upstairs, I heard water run in the shower. A bird struck the window lightly and then recovered, wings stitching the air together. The morning moved forward, untroubled. I didn't tell him that in the last few years I'd started talking to the house when I was alone, or that I'd grown very good at living in the space between gratitude and a loneliness I couldn't quite name. I didn't tell him that the kitchen had slowly become the place where I measured my days. An extra handful of herbs if it had been a good one, an extra minute of stirring if it had not. I didn't tell him any of that because I didn't need to. Somehow, he already knew. When he stood to leave, he picked up the folded towel and placed it carefully on the counter, as if returning a borrowed book to a library shelf. "Thank you," he said, "for the tea, for last night, for this morning. Thank you for the recipe," I said, "and for seeing my kitchen the way I do." He smiled, and we walked to the back door. As he stepped onto the porch, the day had warmed enough that the air felt soft, like red rising. He turned back, hesitated, only for the span of a single heartbeat, and then spoke, very gently. "If you decide to visit the community kitchen, I'll be there next Thursday evening. If you decide not to, the pie will still be beautiful in your hands." It was not a question, not an invitation that required a yes right then. It was a kindness with a timeline. He gave me one last, steady look, the sort that says I will not move closer unless you ask me to, and then he left. I held the recipe card for a long time after the door closed, tracing the loop of the G in sugar where the ink had once smudged. My husband came downstairs in his robe and kissed my cheek. He asked about coffee, about the leftovers, about whether his colleagues had enjoyed themselves. I answered. I smiled. I moved through the morning with ease. It was all true. But inside, something else had begun, as quietly as yeast waking in warm water. Not an affair. Not some reckless hunger. Something deeper, steadier. The memory of who I had been before I started apologizing for taking up space, and the possibility that she might return. Around noon, I pulled out a mixing bowl and set the oven to preheat. I zested the lemon and watched the yellow lift from the rind like sunlight being shaved. I whisked the eggs until their faces smiled back at me, glossy and complete. I followed the card exactly, and when I slid the pie into the oven, I felt a sudden rush of nervous joy that made me laugh out loud, alone in my kitchen. While it baked, I took out the small wooden box where I keep the old things that still matter, a button for my mother's winter coat, a fountain pen that no longer writes, 3 dried peonies pressed flat as paper. At the very bottom was a charcoal pencil, the last survivor of a set that had once made a home on my desk. I rolled it between my fingers until the familiar weight woke a muscle memory in my hand. The timer on the oven ticked steadily. I tore a page from a notepad and began to sketch the lemon sitting on the counter, not because it was important, but because it was there. The pie emerged with a gentle wobble, the custard fragrant and bright. I set it on the rack, and the house filled with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Expectation. On the back of the recipe card, in the blank space beneath the instructions, I wrote a single line with my charcoal pencil, careful not to smudge it. Thursday evening. I didn't add a promise. I didn't cross my heart. I just wrote the time down where I could not pretend I hadn't seen it. That night, when the house settled and the clocks resumed their unhurried count, I sliced the pie and brought 2 plates to the couch. My husband ate his with appreciative hums, told me it reminded him of summers when he was small, when his aunt would make something similar. I told him about Daniel's grandmother's recipe, and we both agreed that families carry one another in such unexpected ways. He leaned against me and dozed through the end of a movie. I watched the credits roll and thought about how many names it takes to make a story. The card was on the counter, waiting. The kitchen lights were low. I stood there a while, listening to the soft breathing of the house that has contained so much of my life, and then I tucked the card back where I knew I'd find it again. I did not yet know what I would do on Thursday. I only knew that the part of me that had gone quiet was no longer asleep, and that more than anything else felt beyond my imagination. Thursday came more quickly than I expected. All week, I carried that recipe card in my apron pocket like a secret, though it was really only a reminder to myself. I had convinced my husband that I wanted to experiment more in the kitchen, so he wasn't surprised when I baked again on Tuesday or when I bought fresh lemons on Wednesday. What he didn't notice, what I wasn't ready to explain, was that each stir of custard, each pinch of zest, felt like a rehearsal for something larger than pie. That morning, I stood at the window and watched the trees bend in the early wind. My husband left for work, kissing my cheek absent-mindedly, already thinking about the meeting he had later that afternoon. I lingered at the door after he drove away, the silence of the house wrapping around me. I should have felt guilty, but I didn't. What I felt was possibility. Still, I spent hours second-guessing. What if going tonight was foolish? What if Daniel's words were just politeness, and I had mistaken kindness for connection? And what if he really had meant them? That last thought frightened me most, not because of him, but because of what it meant about me. I had become used to keeping parts of myself tucked away, folded neatly like linens that no one uses anymore. To let them unfold now would change things. By the time I was ready to leave, the sun was low. I told my husband I'd signed up for a cooking class at the community center, and he smiled, pleased that I was getting out more. I almost laughed at how easy it was. For years, I'd imagined him scrutinizing me, questioning me, but in truth, he trusted me absolutely. And that trust was its own weight. The community kitchen sat at the edge of downtown, tucked between a shuttered bookstore and a laundromat. The air smelled faintly of detergent and yeast from the bakery across the street. I stood outside for a long minute before pushing the door open. Inside, the space glowed with a warmth that wasn't just from the fluorescent lights overhead. There were rows of counters, mixing bowls stacked neatly, and the chatter of people already gathered, men and women, young and old, moving with the nervous excitement of beginners. And then there was Daniel. He was at the far counter, rolling up his sleeves again, as though that small gesture had become his signature. When his eyes met mine, he didn't look surprised. He looked certain, as though he had known I would come. He gave me a nod, a quiet acknowledgement, and I felt something inside me loosen. He introduced me to the group, not as his colleague's wife, but simply as a talented cook who's here to share her gift. I'd almost protested. It felt too generous. But when I saw the way the younger ones leaned in, eager, I accepted the role. It felt good to be seen as something more than an appendage to someone else's life. The evening passed in a blur of activity. Teaching a teenager how to slice an onion without cutting her fingers, showing a veteran how to coax flavor from garlic without burning it, laughing when someone dropped a tomato that rolled clear across the floor. It was chaotic, messy, loud, but there was joy in it. Real, tangible joy. And through it all, Daniel moved near me, never too close, but always present. We didn't need many words. Just a look, a shared laugh, a steady presence when my hands trembled with unexpected emotion. At the end of the night, when the counters were scrubbed and the pots cleaned dry, we walked outside together. The air had cooled, the kind of late evening chill that asks you to pull your coat tighter. We stood under the weak light of the street lamp, not quite ready to part. "You were wonderful in there," he said. "Did you see their faces when you showed them how to taste with their eyes closed first? You gave them more than food." "I gave them what my mother gave me," I admitted. "Patience. And a way to feel like home can live inside you, even if you've never really had one." He nodded slowly. "That's exactly it. That's why I hoped you'd come." Silence fell again, not heavy this time, but thoughtful. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how rare it was for someone to draw out a part of me that had been silent for so long. He didn't ask for it, didn't demand it. He simply made space for it, and in that space, I remembered who I had been before years of schedules and obligations had thinned me down to a role. A car drove past, breaking the moment, but not entirely. Daniel stepped back slightly, his voice quieter now. "I don't want to make this complicated for you," he said. "I only want you to know that you matter. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's host, but as you. And if you choose to keep coming here, I'll be grateful. If not, I'll still be grateful for what you gave tonight." His words settled into me like seeds into soil, small, but carrying the weight of an entire season. I didn't respond right away. I couldn't. Instead, I let the quiet stretch, feeling the night air brush my skin, feeling my heart press against the ribs that had caged it too tightly for too long. When I finally spoke, my voice was soft but steady. "I'll come back. Not for you. Not for them. For me." For the first time in years, I said something purely for myself. His smile was almost imperceptible, but it reached his eyes. That's the best answer I could have hoped for. We parted with a simple good night. No touch, no lingering glance, just the knowledge that something had shifted between us, and even more within me. That night, back in my own kitchen, I placed the recipe card on the counter again. I traced the letters, remembering the warmth of the evening, the laughter, the sense of belonging. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like the walls of the house were pressing in on me. Instead, they seemed to hold me gently, like an embrace. Lying in bed later, my husband beside me, I thought about Daniel's words, about mattering. I realized it wasn't about him at all. It was about me finally stepping back into my own life. And as I drifted to sleep, I felt something bloom inside me, fragile but undeniable. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. It was rediscovery. And that, I knew, was only the beginning. The following weeks unfolded like pages I hadn't realized were still part of my story. Each Thursday, I returned to the community kitchen, and each time, I felt a little more of myself return with me. It wasn't just about cooking. It was about seeing faces light up when they realized they could create something with their own hands. It was about listening to laughter echo against stainless steel counters about the small victories. A sauce not burned, a pie crust that held. It was about belonging to something outside the narrow script I'd been living for years. Daniel was always there, but never in the way that drew attention. He didn't hover, didn't demand. Instead, he shared the work in quiet partnership. Sometimes we spoke at length about recipes, about families, about the ways life bends us in directions we don't expect. Other times, we barely exchanged more than a smile. But even in silence, the connection remained steady and calm. At home, my husband noticed the change in me. He would come into the kitchen and find me humming while stirring a pot, or see me pulling out a sketch pad between chores. "You seem happier," he said one night, his voice tinged with a mix of curiosity and relief. "Whatever that class is, keep going. It suits you." I smiled because it was true. But what I didn't tell him was that it wasn't the class alone. It was remembering myself in the presence of someone who reminded me that I still mattered. One Thursday, near the end of the evening, Daniel asked if I'd like to walk outside for a moment. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke from a nearby chimney. We stood side by side, hands deep in our pockets, gazing at the dark stretch of sky. "I need you to know something," he said quietly. "What's happening here? It isn't about crossing lines or betraying anyone. It's about you remembering what's inside you. I see it each week. You're lighter, stronger, more yourself. That's all I've ever wanted for you." I felt tears sting my eyes, though they weren't born of sadness. "Do you ever think about what could happen if we let this be more?" I asked, my voice trembling with honesty. He turned to me, his expression calm, almost tender. "Of course I think about it. But I also know that sometimes the most important connections aren't meant to be lived out in the ways we expect. Sometimes they exist to remind us of who we are, and to send us back into our lives more whole than before." His words were like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. It wasn't desire that tethered me to him. It wasn't a secret affair waiting to unfold. It was something deeper. A recognition, a mirror held up so I could see myself again. That night when I returned home, I sat at the kitchen table long after my husband had gone to bed. I spread out my sketch pad, sharpened the old charcoal pencil, and began to draw. At first, it was simple, the curve of a lemon, the lines of a spoon. But soon, faces began to emerge on the page. My mother's with her flour-dusted smile. The teenager at the community kitchen concentrating so fiercely on chopping an onion. Daniel, though not in detail, just the shape of his posture, the way his presence felt. The drawings multiplied week after week until the stack of pages became a small gallery of rediscovery. It wasn't about perfection. It was about expression. And with each line, I felt less like a shadow of the woman I had been, and more like the woman I was still becoming. One Saturday, my husband invited friends over again, and I didn't dread it the way I once had. As I moved through the kitchen, I felt a quiet pride. I set the table, poured the wine, served the roast. But this time, I wasn't only hosting. I was present, alive, whole. And though Daniel wasn't there, I felt the echo of what he had given me, not romance, not longing, but a return to myself. Later that evening, as I cleared the dishes, my husband came into the kitchen and slipped his arm around my shoulders. "I don't say this enough," he murmured, "but thank you for everything you do, for making this house feel like home." I looked at him then, really looked. His hair was grayer now, his face lined with years of responsibility and fatigue. He hadn't always been perfect. Neither had I. But beneath the routines and the silences, there was still a foundation. And maybe now, with the parts of me I had rediscovered, I could stand on it again. I rested my head against his shoulder, feeling the weight of his familiarity and the comfort it brought. "You're welcome," I whispered, meaning it more than I had in years. When the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I sat once more at the table, recipe card in hand. I smoothed its worn edges and smiled. It had started as a borrowed piece of paper, a simple lemon custard pie. But in truth, it had become a doorway. Daniel's role in my life wasn't to steal me away, or to ignite some forbidden passion. It was to remind me that even after years of being folded into the lives of others, I was still here, vivid, creative, capable of joy. And as I closed my sketchpad that night, I knew that what followed in my life would no longer be shaped by forgetting who I was, but by remembering. That more than anything else was beyond my imagination.